So it's starting.
Hi everyone, I'm going to give everyone a welcome and look forward to jumping into our webinar sec here. We got a few more minutes for people to sign in, and then we'll jump in and get started. I'm going to give everyone just a couple more minutes here to get signed in. There's a few more people. Looks like they're logging in here, and we'll get started. 1 or 2 more minutes. Great. Welcome everyone to our webinar today. The webinar today is focused on the role of data quality and how it plays in the General Data Protection Regulation, the GDPR. We're excited to have 2 industry experts, Tom Redman, also known as the Data Doc, and as part of our interactive webinar, we'll welcome your questions. And to submit your questions, please type in the question box on the right-hand side of the screen in the GoToWebinar console. And we'll make sure to get, once we get through all the material today, we've definitely blocked out some time at the end to answer any questions you may have. So let's get started. And I'm excited to introduce both of our speakers today who are experts, both in data quality and in the GDPR. First, we have Tom Redman, also known as the Data Doc from Data Quality Solutions, and also Daragh O'Brien from Castlebridge Associates. We are looking forward to hearing from both of them. Both are industry experts in their fields. Tom has a couple books that we invite you to check out, Data's Credibility Problem, and a recently released Getting in Front of Data and Who Does What. Welcome, Tom. Sorry. And Tom, I'll send it over to you. Oh, sorry, Daragh, my bad. Tom, I apologize. Daragh is joining us today from Ireland, and so we have the International Brigade here. Daragh is the founder and CEO of Castlebridge, an information strategy, governance, and privacy consultancy. Daragh's primary degree is in business and law, and he is knowledgeable about the GDPR. So we're looking forward to him sharing his expertise with us today. Again, we'll be recording the webinar, and we'll be sending out a copy of the slides and a link to the webinar when we're done, probably by the end of the day or tomorrow at the latest. Sorry about that, Tom. Now you can take over.
Well, thank you very much, Rob, and thanks to Service Objects for arranging this webinar today. I want to set a slightly different tone for this webinar than you may be used to. All of us are deluged with email every day. So I mean, I must get 20 a day on GDPR. I mean, so much that I don't open much of it anymore, and I'm sure you're in the same boat. Most of it is in the form of, hey, there's this big rule coming at you, and if you don't follow it, it's going to be really, really expensive, kind of thing. And it's sort of, to get your dander up and play defense and so forth. But I think that playing defense is the wrong attitude to take when it comes to GDPR and privacy more generally. And the way that people who understand and promote quality think about this is much more proactive. And if you adopt that tone and that role, it's going to be a lot easier and a lot more powerful. And I'd like to inform this discussion and use this vignette as the tone for this webinar, this fireside chat. The vignette involves my father, and I'm trained as a statistician, off to work at Bell Labs, and after, I don't know, 7 or 8 years there, I pulled on a thread, and it led me to quality, and I started working on quality, and I told my father I was doing this. My father had run clinical trials at Eli Lilly, and I was going into quality, and I could tell from his tone that he thought that this was really a bad move. And but we talked about it, it's a once a week or so, and I told him it's all about satisfying customers and taking cost out and building better products and services, and in the data world, making better decisions and so forth. And I could tell he was pretty skeptical. I think I later found out that quality to him meant, putting the same amount of stuff in those little blue pills or whatever it was that they sold at Lilly. But anyway, then a couple, this went on for a couple of years, and then one day I got a call out of the blue, and just as background, I think my father, called me twice since I left the house when I was 18, and so I got this call from my father. I was worried maybe something was wrong with my mom or something like that, but it wasn't the case at all. What he said was, Tommy, I finally figured out what you're telling me about this quality stuff. And I go, yeah, Dad. And he goes, yeah, it's all about satisfying the customer. He said, my whole career at Lilly, so I'm running clinical trials. I said, I always viewed the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, as the enemy, right? But if I could have recognized that they were people too, with jobs, and just sort of thought about them that way, treated them as a different kind of customer, I would have gotten more drugs approved faster and made my company billions, right? And he pauses for a second, and he said, and Tommy, they would have made me president. Okay. And I have found that this tone, this attitude, and thinking about regulators as customers too, is just so powerful, so much more compelling, so much simpler, that I urge everyone to adopt this tone as they think about GDPR and GDPR compliance. And I'd like to challenge now Daragh in the part that's followed. So Daragh, tell us, who are the customers? Who are the regulators? What's best we understand what they want? And then maybe more generally, who are the customers for privacy? And what do they need? Where's that going? Please take it away, Daragh.
Okay, well, in terms of who the customer is for privacy, let me get control. Yeah, so, well, first of all, just very quickly summarize GDPR in terms of answering that question. Okay, so GDPR is based on these key fundamental core principles of lawfulness, fairness, transparency, purpose limitation, data minimization, accuracy, storage limitation, integrity, confidentiality, and accountability. We're going to touch on some of these through the course of this chat, Tom. But let's build this slide a little bit here in terms of where we're going to go with this. One of the key things in GDPR is it puts this explicit focus on governance. And one of the reasons we have that focus on governance is the regulator is one of your customers. So when you think about your stakeholder view and this risk-based approach to data privacy that GDPR brings to bear, this risk-based approach means we're thinking about the organization internally. Your internal peers are customers for your privacy program because they want to know that they can do certain things with the data that they have about people, that describes people. The individuals whose data you have, your customers, your suppliers, like that guy who drives the sandwich truck to the office every day. You have his data somewhere in the system from a security point of view, so that he can get in and give you your sandwiches. If there's a problem with that data, you don't get your sandwiches. But he's a customer of your privacy program because if something goes wrong, if there's a security breach or if someone decides to use all that supplier data for an unrelated or new purpose, that could have an impact on his ability to do his job or enjoy his private life. So there's these different categories of individuals that you're dealing with on a day-to-day basis. And that risk-based context, that view of balancing competing interests and rights, that's when you get into the balancing act where the regulators become the customer. And what they're trying to determine is, from their point of view, they want to see how much homework you've done. How much documentation have you got evidencing your thought processes around what you're doing with data? What do you have that they can look at and say, hey, we know you're running your shop well. We know that you're thinking about these things. We know that you're not running with scissors. We know that you're not doing the data equivalent of driving down the interstate at 120 miles an hour with 3 bottles of bourbon open on the seat in front of you and bald tires on your car. And that's where the regulators are a customer of what you're trying to achieve as well. So I'm just going to skip forward a little bit in terms of our discussion, in terms of some of the other stuff that's coming down the pipeline. We got this e-privacy regulation as well that we're going to talk about. And again, this broadens the scope out from just being data about people to being data about how we're interacting online, data about how our phone. So your smartphone, Tom, it's a wonderful device. We're both telco guys. We like the technology a lot in telco, but your phone is an interesting proxy for who you are. I worked with one client recently who were doing an analytics program looking at tracking the device identifiers of phones in a city to see traffic patterns, footfall patterns past buildings. So their customer for that application, from an analytics perspective, was going to be advertising agencies, where they're going to be able to where they're going to be able to tell them where to put the big billboards where people tended to be standing still for long periods of time in this particular city. Because they're going to overlay with a street gazette and a street map of buildings, so they knew where people were standing and what they were, and understand the dynamic of flow in the city. They were a little bit put out when I asked them, did they propose not to run that on Thursdays, Fridays, Saturdays, and Sundays? Because the impact on the individuals who were carrying those phones was that it was going to identify if they were at a place of worship. Because if your phone is sitting still for 30 minutes to 2 hours outside a church or a mosque or a synagogue, well, that's usually a good proxy indicator that you might be spending some time there for spiritual enlightenment. If you're going to the library and you're spending a lot of time in the stacks reading quality books, well, that means you're a Juranist and you're worshiping in the Church of Joseph Juran, and that might be something to do with your philosophical beliefs. But the customer that they wanted to sell the data to hadn't thought about that implication. The telco hadn't thought about that implication. But a regulator looking at that project would have said, well, show me the analysis. Show me your thought process for how you're taking that data from your telecoms network and how you're using that proxy data that singles people out and allows them to be identifiable. And how are you doing that in a way that means you're not saying, hey, we know where all the people who are pastafarians go to worship on a Thursday evening. And that's how you're looking at these different customers, these different customer perspectives in terms of what we're doing with data, Tom. So in terms of who the regulator is, this is where we get into interesting challenges from a GDPR perspective, because we have this European legislation, but because we're living in a global world, because we're extremely connected now with the wonderful, wonderful World Wide Web, we need to be aware that within Europe, there are different regulators. So if you're coming from the US and you want to do business with Europe, there are 28 countries you're dealing with. We operate within a large trading bloc in a socio-economic union. We may be losing one of our friends shortly through Brexit, and we will miss them sadly. But you have a number of different regulators. You have the European Data Protection Board under GDPR, who are the collective body of all regulators. You then have national regulators, and in some European countries, there are actually provincial level regulators as well. So Germany, for example, has a number of provincial level regulators. And there's a pecking order in terms of how they operate as supervisory authorities. So if you're coming from Delaware and you're selling into Bavaria, you will deal with a Bavarian provincial regulator, you'll deal with a German federal regulator, and then you may deal with the European Data Protection Board as the overarching regulator to deal with. But it's also important to bear in mind that the European data privacy. Tom?
So Daragh, this is Tom. I mean, and this is a really key point, I think. I mean, it's easy to talk about the regulators, right? As if they were sort of one mass, one sort of, uni thinking on everything, right?
Yeah.
But there's a bunch of regulators here, right? And just like, different customers have different needs, we should expect that different regulators are going to have different needs. And even at the lowest level, a provincial regulator in Bavaria may think different than a provincial regulator in Paris, for example.
Exactly. And they're all required by law to be independent, but they're also required by law to have a collaborative approach to ensuring consistency across the European Union. So that's one of the things that GDPR is doing is creating mechanisms to help develop some more consistent approaches. But you're dealing with different cultural views in different European countries, like in the Nordic, Scandinavian countries, they're much more open about tax data than Ireland would be, or than parts of France would be, for example. Even in France, my dad lives in France, and the attitude of his neighbors compared to people from Paris, totally different culture in terms of how they deal with people, even their dialect, their accents, their way of thinking about the world is different. Things really slow down in the part of France my dad lives in. And that is apparent in regulators as well, different attitudes, different perspectives. And each individual member state in the European Union will have a number of different areas in the GDPR that will have local variations on how it's implemented. An example will be the age of consent for children. So the age at which below which you need to get parental permission for processing of data about children. In Ireland, that's going to be set at 13. In France, that's going to be 16. And that's an example of the different variations we'll have. And then you got different courts, different legal systems that are all working together, and individuals can go to their court in their country, and then that will escalate through the legal systems in different member state courts towards the European Court of Justice, who tries to arbitrate and develop a standard ruling across the European Union. Much like the US Supreme Court arbitrates across the federal courts, the state level courts, in terms of how law in the United States should be interpreted as well. So there's different flavors there we need to deal with. So here's a scenario where we've got Gaston living in France who buys socks online from a company in Cork. So in terms of understanding how the regulators interplay, again, the pointer there is a bit of a data quality problem. That pointer is actually nearer Madrid than France. I put that slide together a little bit quickly. But Gaston is living in France and he's buying socks from a company in Cork. Because both Gaston and the company in Cork are in the European Union, what will happen from a regulatory perspective is we're dealing with this supervisory authority regulatory hierarchy, where Gaston, if there's a problem, will complain to the regulator in France, who will then pass the complaint to the Irish Data Protection Authority, who will investigate the complaint. And if the French authority are happy with how that complaint progresses, there will be no problem. But if they are concerned, they can then escalate that to the European Data Protection Board, who will arbitrate and determine across all the regulators what the best outcome needs to be in that context. So Gaston can complain to French regulator, and it moves along that way. And that's internally in the European market. They were trying to simplify the process for individuals. Now, when we look at the idea of cross-border data transfers, where we got the US dealing with customers who are based in Europe. So Gaston's living in France and he's buying socks from a company in San Diego. So the San Diegan company is actively targeting and selling into the into the French market. They're intending to sell to people who are geographically located in the European Union. This is a key point to make about GDPR. I've seen a lot of comment online and discussion online, people saying, if you're selling to EU citizens, you have a problem. If you're selling to people who are resident in the European Union, you have a problem. It's actually simpler than that. If they are geographically located at a point in time in the European Union, the GDPR applies to their data at that point in time. So in this context, the San Diegan company has to comply with Privacy Shield or other cross-border data transfer obligations, which means that they'll be coming under the regulatory control of the FTC in that context. And in this case, we have not the Irish Data Protection Commission, but the French Data Protection Authority, the FTC, and the California State's Attorney General will be involved from a regulatory perspective. So again, 3 potential regulatory bodies investigating any incident that might arise in this context. If we flip the scenario and Joy is in San Diego buying socks from a company in Ireland, so we have a nice San Diegan motorbiker who wants to get some nice warm socks from a company in Ireland, well, if something goes wrong in terms of the handling of that data, the Irish company selling the socks falls under the remit of the Irish Data Protection Authority, so EU law applies to that transaction, so Joy benefits from the protection of EU law because the company is based in Europe. Joy would have to complain to the Irish Data Protection Authority. She could choose to do so through the FTC if she wanted to, and there's a lot of cross-border regulatory cooperation in terms of enforcement action and enforcement processes. Finally, if we have the scenario where Brendan is an Irish citizen living in Orlando and he buys a guitar from a company in San Diego. San Diego is on my mind because I'm going to EDW in April. Well, Brendan is living in Florida and he buys a guitar from Guitars R Us in San Diego. Everything is governed by the US laws, governed by the law of Orlando, the law of the state of Florida and the law of the state of California. The FTC may get involved. States attorneys general in Florida and in California may get involved, but there is no role for the European Union in this context because there is no physical geographical presence in the European Union of any of the actors or any of the parties. So that's why it's important to figure out who your regulator is in terms of who your audience is in this context. So the regulator, as you said, Tom, 28 national member state regulators, 27 after the UK leaves. There's a consistency cooperation mechanism in place. They're all legally independent of member states' governments. Similar to judiciary, they can't be influenced legally by member state governments. And if the company has subsidiaries in the European Union, they could, if they're based outside the European Union, but they have a subsidiary here, that subsidiary will be enforced against. And international law allows for regulators to coordinate cooperation with other regulators globally in terms of enforcement actions. And that has happened on a few occasions. So in terms of who our customer is living individuals. Regulators, despite the cold, grey, clammy skin of the auditor, are living individuals. Any living person whose data you're holding, who is geographically located in the European Union, if you're engaged in commerce or analytics activities that are focusing or targeting the European Union, they fall within the scope of European data protection law, they fall within the scope of GDPR, and the key thing is living individuals. Now, interesting wrinkles and variations, some EU member states also extend these protections to the deceased, Italy being one. And again, that's an example of different cultural aspects to be aware of. But the customer here is living people, and regulators are living people. So that person who turns up to do an audit or inspection, when I work with clients, I always tell them to find out what type of biscuits the individual likes, make sure there's warm coffee in the room, let them know where the sandwich bar is. So because they're humans, and treating them with respect and giving them kind support is nice. Treating them with respect is important. One thing to bear in mind, and again, I had to put some stats in here, Tom, because I know you like stats, and forgive me if this is really badly drawn graph. But what we have here is a graph showing the number of countries worldwide that do not have a national privacy law versus countries that do have a national or federal level data privacy law. And we're looking at 62.5% of the world's population covered by some level of privacy laws, with the European frameworks being the benchmark standard increasingly, and the US increasingly being an outlier, falling further and further behind in terms of the global best practice for data privacy laws. So this is where we're moving a little bit out of the discussion of thinking about compliance and thinking about ethics and best practice and setting good standards. There is a wonderful scope here for organizations to compete on privacy. And a lot of US companies, leading companies like Apple, are doing a pretty good job on building their capabilities to compete on privacy because they're looking at this global legislative trend. They're also looking at what is going to be the best thing for their customer. the users of their products or services. And in doing that, they're having to understand, well, what is it that's going to make things easier for regulators? How are they going to work with them, or at least not work against them? And much like your father, Tom, they're figuring out that if they don't treat the regulator as the enemy, they will actually be able to create a better dynamic for building quality outcomes into their processes, into their products, etc.
And you're making the point that leading U.S., I mean, the U.S., which in terms of law is behind, but in your view, leading U.S. companies are already thinking about this, independent of regulation, that this is the right way they want to be as a company.
Yeah, law exists. Well, my economics lecturer used to say that legal regulations were the stick with the nail in it that was in the invisible hand of Adam Smith. So the Adam Smith's description of the free market, the invisible hand controlling everything, and there's a stick with a nail in it, which is legal regulatory enforcement. Legislation emerges in response to a need to address bad actors. In the same way as we've seen legislation around manufacturing product quality, we've seen legislation around data quality, like the Sarbanes-Oxley Act. Wonderful example of something that was essentially a piece of data quality legislation to make sure you could trust what was on the balance sheet, and you had good data lineage for what got onto the balance sheet, so that significant special causes of error could be identified and controlled. What we're finding out here, we're eventually coming to at this point, is that the old paradigm for data gathering and data analytics is increasingly no longer valid, because this is one of my favorite Dilbert cartoons has summed this point up. Traditionally, we viewed data as being something we could monetize as an asset, and it was okay to do it because the customer would do it to us if they could too, and we dehumanized the people. We dehumanized our customers by calling them data. In the same way as the transport industry used to dehumanize its customers by referring to them as self-loading freight. And that's a term that is now barred in most good transport operators. But I've heard it, I work with a couple of transport companies. I have heard older members of staff referring to human passengers as self-loading freight. And we're at the same tipping point in the data world, where we need to realize that the things that we are processing that we're currently calling data are simply a representation of something that exists in the real world, who could be who is a living, breathing person with feelings, with emotions, with rights, and with aspirations and hopes. And how we handle their data has an impact on all of those things.
Daragh, thanks. Right. I think that's a spot on sort of way to end that part of the discussion. It's very clear that meeting the needs of the customers, including the regulators and real people, as you pointed out, is sure to be the challenge for businesses. Tom, can you talk a little bit more about how data quality fundamentals fit into the GDPR picture?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Daragh, and thank you, Rob. And so if we can go to the next slide. Very good. So what I want to spend a few minutes talking about is just the fundamentals of proactive data quality management. I worked with a couple of companies who are sort of trying to sort out their GDPR plans and where quality fits in, and I've participated in a lot of discussions, and it seems to me that what's really missing is a good understanding of 3 or 4 fundamental points, and so it's kind of like, the first couple of these are sort of data quality 101, and then a couple of them are data quality 201. And I want to go over these. And in particular, I just don't see how you have a hope of meeting GDPR minimally, never mind maximally, the way that Daragh has just talked about, without following these principles. So let's go over them. I mean, in here, on this slide now, as you sort of see the formal definition of data quality, and you can read it. Data quality are of high quality if they are fit for their intended uses by customers in the ways that they're using them. So I I'm responsible for this definition, and I've explicitly added analytics to it in the last couple of years, just because of some of the things that that Daragh is talking about. Customers using data to decide where to put the billboard. Data from your phones. I mean, just something that we would not have conceived of even half a dozen years ago. And so the point here is things in quality are tethered to customers, and customers are those who are impacted by the data. And this concept of fitness for use, I mean, it's very easy to kind of like, yeah, that makes sense without thinking about it deeply, but it is a deep concept. And the way I came to understand it is as follows, and then you can tell how old people are by the example they use. But what I came to understand it, there was sort of this discussion of two iconic cars. One was the Cadillac, and the other was the Volkswagen. And some people thought that the Volkswagen was of higher quality because it just was defect free. It started all the time. It didn't have to go in for repair very often, and so forth. And others thought it was the Cadillac, right? And the argument of the Cadillac was, oh, it is big and it's comfortable. When you take a trip on it, you can take a nap in the back seat. There's plenty of room for suitcases. And when I drive my Cadillac into my neighborhood, my neighbors know that I've arrived, right? And so the question went back or forth, and basically what Dr. Duran was able to recognize was people were talking about two separate sort of dimensions of quality. And when those who liked the Volkswagen were basically talking about a car that was defect free, right? It performed as expected without error. But those who were talking about the Cadillac were thinking about quality in terms of features. And Duran recognized that you had to synthesize those two together, and that different people would like different combinations of feature sets and have different tolerances for error, right? And so the point was there was no sort of average quality, right? It is this product with this set of features and this sort of kinds of defects was of high quality for these customers doing these kinds of things, right? Quality is not a concept on average, and so when we apply those to the data space, right? So this freedom from defects is, are the data right? Are they correct? And then it could be correct enough or current enough, and so on and so forth. You can see some dimensions of data quality that sometimes people talk about. And then on the other side is do we have the right data? If we're trying to make a decision, do we have the right data to make the decision? Do we have the right data to get the package to somebody's house? Do we have the right data to protect our customers' privacy? Do we have the right data to explain to the regulator that we're behaving in a responsible way? And so the point of this slide is you're going to have to adapt a proactive approach to data quality. Spend a few minutes really thinking through fitness for use and customers in your context, and in particular in the GDPR context. So I seem not to have control. So Rob, if you could put up the next slide, I'd appreciate it. This slide is called the data quality lake, and quite honestly, in our prep meeting, somebody asked if it would be appropriate to update this slide. It sort of is true that this slide has been around for a long time. At the same time, it's proved unmatched at helping people understand the fundamental management choice that they have to make when it comes to data quality. And so we kept this slide, and what the slide is all about is an analogy, and in the analogy we have a lake, and the lake is filled with water, and by analogy, we have a database and data in the database. The other thing you can see is we have a stream which is feeding the lake, putting new water into the lake, and some sources of dirty water. It's a chemical factory, in a paper mill, whatever it is, right? They're putting dirty water into the stream, which wins its way into the lake. The stream in the analogy is a business process that's creating or modifying data, and the chemical factory and the paper mill are the sources that are of effluent. Not pictured on the slide are people drinking from the water, or fishing in the water, or bathing, catching fish, whatever it may be. The customers of the data and the customers of the lake, and in contrast, the customers of the data. And so now the point of the slide is that when it comes to a clean lake, basically you have a couple of choices. Choice number one is you can let people drink it. You can get very good at hauling them off to hospital, pumping their stomachs, and trying to make them better. The second thing you can do is you can clean up the lake, and people do that all the time in different ways. They spray the water up in the air, they run it through filters, they run it through settling tanks, they adjust the pH with chemicals and so forth to clean up the water. And then the third thing you can do is you can try to start putting clean water in the lake by reducing the effluent at the chemical factory and the paper mill, and the same applies for data. So, right, in faced with bad data, you can let people who use it deal with the problem, and we find that they're dealing with the problem all the time. The most recent study of this, finally a credible study on actual data quality levels, is that very nearly 98%, 93 and change percent of data is not fit for use. The average is 53% of data records have errors in them. They're not fit for use. So the second thing you can do about it is you can try to clean up the data before it does much harm, before people use it. And then the third choice is to start making it so that you don't create so many errors, to find the root causes of error, to take the steps such that you eliminate those root causes and you start creating clean data. Companies, we find over and over, companies are loaded with data quality problems, and north of 90% of them are very, very simple, and you can eliminate the root causes of 90% of the new errors, right? And so this is the proactive approach to data quality. The proactive approach is that you have to get in front. You have to prevent errors at their points of creation. Okay, and so you have to do this. Now the summary advice is this. Okay, so whenever you can, you should first work to make the stream clean, and then worry about cleaning up the residual errors in the database. Work first to make the process create new data, and then clean up the lake. And now sometimes business priorities mean you can't do that. But if all you're doing is cleaning up the lake, then you have doomed yourself to doing it forever and ever. And in fact, with increasing data volumes, it's just going to get to be a harder and harder job. So the management choice is how you're going to address data quality, and in particular for GDPR, it's really important that you adopt a bias, right? Spend as much time as you can working up in the points of data creation, such that you have the high quality data that you need to meet regulator and other customer needs. And frankly, it's a whole lot easier than cleaning up the bad data. So Rob, if you could go to the next slide, I just want to comment here that so well, what's the work involved? And this is the process management cycle. There's a neat summary of the work that you need to do. And the thing I like most about this is really clarifying management responsibilities. You know, there is an important management responsibility that if you're creating data, you have to understand who uses it and what for, and you have to do your best to then understand what customers need and later in the cycle to create data that meets those needs. And so, but anyway, what I like most about this particular setup of the work you need to do is the clarity about management responsibilities and step one, and then step two is, you know, understanding customers and their needs and for GDPR is how as Daragh described. You need to describe that process. How does this stream really work? What's going on? You need to make some measurements and you know, find out, you know, how you doing, good, bad, or indifferent. Control plays a role, conformance to requirements, and then steps 6 and 7 are about finding and eliminating those root causes of error. And the last part of step 7 says sustain the gains. I mean, there is nothing worse than finding and eliminating the root cause and taking your eye off the ball, and 3 or 4 months later having that root cause return. So no, look, I mean, you've got to do this work. You have to do these things to have high quality data, and I particularly like the process management cycle as a powerful, repeatable means of pulling these tasks together in just a really, really powerful synthesis. So let me make one more remark on one more slide, Rob, if I may, and then we'll and then I think we should have plenty of time for questions. One of the things that I find in data quality is that another way to approach data quality that just kind of looks like this. It says, understand your business, understand what's going on in your business, right? Have a good understanding of your customers, have a good understanding of what they want, have a good understanding of the constraints around your business, and so forth. And one of the things that has gone out of fashion, right, but except I find that, you know, companies that have these things have a real leg up is the notion of a conceptual model. I mean, conceptual data model, right, is basically a deep understanding of those things in the data that are most important to your business. And of course, here what we're talking about, I mean, you know, look, companies have lots of those things, right? I don't think that GDPR requires that you have a conceptual model of all of them, but really, if you have a great conceptual model of people or your clients, some people call these a party models. I mean, that's somebody that we do business with or know about in some way, shape, or form, then it is just so much more helpful.
Tom, just to cut across there, Tom, GDPR doesn't call it out as a conceptual model, but in the requirements for documenting your processing activities, it requires you to identify the categories of individuals, the categories of data subjects whose data you're handling. So who are the people whose data you have? What categories of those people do you have? So is it customer, supplier, employee, patient, whatever industry you're in? What classification do you have on those? It also requires you to have a classification model for organizations that you might, third parties you might share data with. So is that law enforcement bodies, peer organizations, things like that, which means you're getting into the world of having to say, hang on a second, how do we, either you're in the weeds of having to document everything at the level of, we share data with Bob, we share data with Dave, and we have data about Tom, or do you say we have data about customers and we share that data with shipping providers and with our external finance and debt collection agencies, and identifying the entity type that the specific attribute and the specific instance of the object sits within, means you got to get some sort of conceptual level model. And when we work with clients, we start with sticky notes on a wall, and we ask people, what are your key functions in the organization? Take out your business cards, everybody. Have a look at the word that's beside director of. That's usually a key function. And then what are the key things you need to know about to do that function? And we just capture that on a sticky note. And then we try and collate them all together into a common set of things that the organization needs to know about. And then we say, well, these are the people things. We're looking at that today from a GDPR perspective. The non-people things we'll come back to later on.
Right. Yeah. Brilliant, Daragh. Thank you for that. I mean, and you know, there's like it's a lot of things are easier when you deal with them at the right level of abstraction. Right. And this is one of these things where if you pull it up to the right level, first of all, you'll understand your business better. And then secondly, as you just described, it'll be a lot easier to satisfy the regulator. The last comment I want to make is that both GDPR and data quality, you know, take them separately, take them together. Really, you know, we're talking about the intersection of the two, and they both fall into the form of many hands make light work. And so obviously you have to have some coordinator, and so you have data protection and quality officers and so forth. And the two of them really ought to be working together, right? But if you do this right, there's a little bit more work for everybody every day until they get in the hang of it, and then there's a whole lot less. I mean, that's the thing about quality is you know, people are spending too much time correcting data, and initially you make an investment, but then you can make it so they don't have to correct data all the time. Then big savings to the company. So, Rob, let's do we have some questions? And
we sure do. Thank you guys, both Tom and Daragh. While you guys were presenting, we definitely got quite a few questions. We'll try and cover all of them. We only have about 10 minutes left here, so we'll do our best to get them all in. Let me read the first one, and I think this one's probably for Daragh. Does the GDPR only apply to new data, or does it also apply to existing data in a business?
It applies to all your data. Once you have it, you have it. And GDPR will apply. You need to have a plan in place for going back and looking at your legacy data and making sure that it meets the new quality standard that you're being expected to adhere to. Once you have the data, once you're processing it or using it, the legislation applies. There's no data before the 25th of May is under different rules. It's, as with all new standards or any new legislation, it bites and it affects everything you have. So option one, delete all your data on the 24th of May, start with a clean slate, which is a perfectly valid risk managed approach, or bite the bullet, come up with a plan, develop your governance framework and develop your quality plan to get to where you need to be. And from a regulatory perspective, again, think about the regulator as a customer. What they would much rather see in an organization is not people hiding their head under the pillow hoping this goes away. They'd much rather see that you have a clear and compelling plan that's properly resourced for dealing with your legacy issues, rather than you simply saying you're not going to do anything about it because it's too hard. If it's too hard, well, the regulator will hit you because you're making their life hard. And whereas if you have a plan, it means they got something they can work with and they can help you with going forward.
Makes sense.
Yeah, let me just jump in here too. I mean, it's also the part of the wisdom of the lake slide, right? I mean, yes, you must deal with legacy issues, but if you only deal with legacy issues between now and May 25th, then on May 25th, 2019, you're going to have legacy issues that are going to be just as big as the ones you have now, right? Because you will have created all that new data, and so this is part of the trick. And is first of all, is that you have to recognize there is that trap of just dealing with the legacy issues, and then as Daragh said, you know, from a risk perspective, I mean, how are you going to balance these two things, right? In most cases, and you know, we'll see how it turns out in GDPR. The wise thing is spend as much as your time dealing with the issues going forward, and then once you make it so that you know your new data is coming in fine, and your new processes are working fine, then clean up the existing. And so, Daragh, we'll have to see how that turns out.
Sure.
Yeah, I agree, Tom. I think the analogy I draw is that you need to stop the bleeding, stop the hurt. You need to put the filter into so that the crud isn't coming from the lake. So fix your processes going forward, but you need to have a plan for dealing with the crud that's in the lake.
Yeah.
There's no point trying to fight a fire while you have a gasoline hose pointing into your home. You need to turn the gasoline hose off so that you can fight that fire.
Right. That's a great analogy. Let me get to the next question here. Again, Daragh, this might be more for you, but Tom, please chime in. Are there currently any GDPR certification bodies that can give a business a stamp of approval and show customers they are in compliance?
Short answer, no. Long answer, hell no, and any organization that's claiming that is acting fraudulently. There are provisions within the GDPR for such certification schemes to be established, but no such schemes currently exist. Likewise, for accreditation of skills in the space, while the GDPR allows for the creation of certification schemes for practitioners, no such syllabus currently exists. I've seen a couple of organizations where people are claiming that they've got an ISO accredited GDPR certification. The ISO standard that they're relying on is the ISO standard for professional accrediting systems. So it's the standard that says, have you done these things in order to manage your certification process? It has nothing to do with the actual skills, knowledge, and competences that you need to be applying. My recommendation, and I'm slightly biased because I sit on the board of DAMA International, is a good grounding in basic data management principles, a good understanding of data governance, and a good understanding of information quality puts you in a really good place as a practitioner to start dealing with these issues. But for an organization looking for a shiny badge, no such badge yet exists. So it's very much back to how good do you think you want to be, rather than setting a minimum standard of a badge.
I think that leads perfectly into the next question, Daragh, and I think, Tom, this might be more for you. What do you, with the GDPR, I'm just going to read it. It's a little hard for me to read. Do you think this is going to force businesses all over the world to accept best practices or face potential compliance fines outside of the GDPR and the EU?
Do I think that's going to happen?
Yeah.
Well, look. I mean, I'm of the opinion that, like, you know, how is this going to turn out? And I'm not a great historian, but my read of history was, you know, during the heyday of the industrial age, right? So, you know, there were lots of very, very dangerous products, and people got hurt by them, right? And then pretty soon, regulation caught up and sort of forced people to begin making safer products. And most companies, you know, sort of either ahead of that or behind that, realized that product safety was a big deal too. So, I mean, in some formulations that you ran, product safety was a third dimension. And now nobody thinks about, you know, whether products ought to be safe or not. Of course they ought to be safe, right? And when they're not, it makes international news. We just saw this, you know, not too long ago with the bags. What do you call those? The bags, the bags in cars. Airbags. I'm sorry. Yeah. Yeah, right. The airbags, and you know, and Tanaka had some problems with airbags, with, you know, the explosives sort of you know coming wrong and under certain conditions, and you know those airbags are in millions of cars, and you know, I mean the you know, everyone came down on them, and I believe that company is now out of business, right? I mean, the national and international news for months and months and months, and so. You know, 20 years ago, when I was still at AT&T, the way people thought that through was, they said, you know, privacy will be to the information age what product safety was to the industrial age, right? And in the end, product safety just became a condition of entry into the industrial age. I mean, you know, by the way, so much so that you can buy a cup of coffee at some places, and there'll be a label on it that says, "Caution, contents may be hot." Right? You know, some think it went way overboard and cite that example. Well, I mean, I think that that sooner or later, privacy is going to be treated the same way, and it's going to be treated this way all over the world as product safety was. I mean, there's lots of individual variation, but my read of the way people and societies and companies reacted was that's the way that became, and I think it's going to happen on privacy. Now, I think it was maybe in '97 or '99, somebody named Scott McNeely, made the point that you have no privacy anymore. Anyway, get over it, right? But I think Daragh really showed that the tide has turned on that one, right? The demand for privacy from governments and regulators, and the recognition that it's a good business practice is from many leading companies, right? We're on the right path there, so it may take a long time, and that's part of the reason I think it's good to be in front of it. But privacy is just going to be viewed as a basic human right within, I don't know, 10 or 15 years.
Well, I think in terms of where we're coming from, in terms of the influence of GDPR, I think, first of all, in Europe, it is a basic human right, and that's where we're coming from, first of all. But in terms of the influence and impact, I agree completely with Tom that what we're going to see here is something very similar to product quality and manufacturing quality. In fact, I reread Joseph Duran's speech from the 1980s where he introduced the concept of the quality trilogy. And I basically took his examples of what the problems he was seeing and took the word quality out and substituted in privacy. And he could give that speech today and he will be proclaimed a privacy advocate. Word for word, the same categories of problems exist. While he talked about privacy, what he talked about quality, we could talk about privacy today. From a pure mechanics perspective, GDPR is going to have a significant impact. And it will drag the standards up worldwide. And any company that doesn't get with the program is going to start falling behind. Any country that doesn't get with the program is going to start falling further behind. First of all, it will become illegal for EU-based companies who are doing business with third-party suppliers to use third-party suppliers who don't meet the adequate standards. So they either need to be in a country that's recognized as having an adequate legal framework, or they need to be putting in place self-certification frameworks to meet appropriate standards. That's going to create a drive worldwide for countries to start implementing similar legal frameworks. So the tide will start rising. We're seeing 62.5% now. It is a hockey stick graph. Most of the data privacy laws that have been passed worldwide have been passed in the last 15 years. On the other hand, we have the increased level of awareness and understanding on the part of individuals because of the wonderful benefits of social media. People are becoming more socialized and homogenized in their view of certain things like privacy standards. 20 years ago, if I was looking at Japan as a target market for our consulting practice, there would have been a different emphasis on privacy. Today, while the emphasis is there, is still slightly different culturally. We're very close to having a trade agreement between the EU and Japan that's built around common privacy standards. And those things are going to start driving the agenda up. And organizations that want to get ahead of that need to start looking at, well, what do we do from an ethical perspective in terms of handling data well? What's the right thing for our customer? What's the right thing for our company? And I keep going back to Kurt Ishikawa wrote back in the 80s describing quality that the first obligation of every company was to work to make the people around them and connected with them happy. And if they couldn't do that, they didn't deserve to be in business. From a privacy perspective, it's the same thing. And I keep this Scott McNeely quote that Tom used there earlier on. When he made that comment back in the 90s that privacy was dead, get over it. He went home in his car with tinted windows to his house that had blinds, and he sat and watched TV, I'm sure. And no one could peer in the window at him at that point in time. So he did things to protect his privacy, and I'm sure he didn't go around with a cell phone number tattooed on his forehead.
Perfect. I think that kind of leads maybe into maybe a little bit the next set of questions, which is centered around demonstrating compliance, Daragh. Can you give some examples of what that would look like?
Well, first of all, it's transparency. It's how well are you explaining to people in a clear, concise, and intelligible way what you're going to do with their data. It's what I call the mother-in-law test. If I can't explain something one of our clients is proposing to do to my mother-in-law, it's probably something they shouldn't be doing. Also, if you are asking people to write down, to communicate out to people what they're doing with data, and they say, oh, if you write that down, they won't like it. Well, that's probably something you shouldn't be doing. And that's a good way of demonstrating compliance, putting in place governance structures where you can record that you've had those discussions and you've done those sorts of assessments from a documentation and paperwork perspective.
Is that paperwork? Sorry, Daragh, just a quick. Does that paperwork, is that constitute sort of proof that you're trying to be in compliance?
Yeah, that shows in the same way as having a quality specification and evidence of inspection and testing in a manufacturing context or in a data quality perspective. That specification of information product, that demonstration of your controls, that demonstration of governance is very valuable, useful stuff, because it means when something goes wrong, and it will go wrong, we can't prevent bad things from happening. You can say, well, here's the work we did. Can you help us figure out where we went wrong? In the same way as if a supplier to Toyota has a huge problem, Toyota go to them and say, show us your documentation, show us your processes for how this thing was created, and we'll help you improve it. Because Toyota consider their suppliers to be customers of theirs in that context. If Toyota turn up to a manufacturer and the manufacturer says, well, we've got nothing written down, well, Toyota reduced their number of suppliers globally by 1 within 24 hours.
Right. It's also an important point here. I mean, look, there's no proactive reporting requirements, right? I mean, you know, you respond to the regulator when the regulator comes calling.
Yeah, you respond to the regulator when the regulator comes calling, but when the regulator comes calling, when I was running regulatory in the phone company, we had the philosophy of the magic ring binder. We kept reports and evidence of the operation of our controls. So if we were ever hit with a spot audit by the regulator, we would simply give them the ring binder and a flask of coffee and a meeting room, and they could read the ring binder, and if they had questions, they could come back to us. And the regulator actually viewed that as being an effective evidence that we were running a tight ship, because we had the ring binder to produce when they came looking for it. Other things you could look at in terms of evidence of your effectiveness of your controls and your governance, measuring training. Not just did people turn up, but did they actually learn anything? And measuring the behaviors people have, looking at doing some spot checks and audits and trialing some of your processes, or even doing something simple like buying one of your own products and seeing how the data gets handled. Seeding your databases with sample records to see, do people access the data without authorization? Various things that can be done to demonstrate effectiveness. And a lot of it depends on how much money you're willing to spend, what your risk appetite is, and how clever or devious do you want to be about tracking and managing this in the organization. Or you can just piggyback on your existing data quality programs, looking at accuracy, looking at where an inaccuracy has been found in data, how long does it take to get it fixed? The time to fix is a really good proxy metric for your GDPR obligations, because there's an obligation on you to keep data accurate, and there's a right for individuals where there is an error found to have it corrected.
Makes sense. Maybe that leads into the next question. Do you feel that there are certain GDPR regulations that are going to be enforced first?
Well, there's one regulation. It's a singular thing, so that the entire body of law is enforced from 88 days time, 88 working days. So in terms of what aspect of it will be approached, the regulatory mood music at the moment is very much around transparency. So being upfront with people what's happening with data, being clear about what data you're processing, what data you're getting, how you're using it. If you're doing analytics and running algorithms on the data, being able to explain the logic of that processing. That's one aspect, but also accountability, your internal governance controls, your ability to know where your data is, what you're doing with it, and where you got it from. That lineage aspect, that describing your process in Tom's process management lifecycle, being able to identify who the customers are, what they need, what their expectations are, what they understand is going to happen to their data, which is your transparency piece. And then that accountability piece is describe your process. And if you can't describe your process, please, for the love of God, stop running your process, because you don't know what you're doing.
Got it. A couple more here, and I think we can start to wrap up. This one's around supplementary information, and I'll just read. Part of the regulation allows for customers to provide you, companies, with or request supplementary information. How does that process work, and what is meant by supplementary by providing a supplementary information or statement?
This is in relation to the right of rectification, which is the right to have an error about your data corrected. So if for whatever reason you are not able to edit or fix or correct the original record, the obligation on the organization is to take the additional information the customer or the individual who's raising the request has that they think presents an additional perspective on the factual state that the data should be in, and be able to append that into your database in some way. In terms of the process for how you would do that, the obligation is on the organization to define its own process for doing that. And there is a case study from the Irish Data Protection Regulator. Again, this is an existing right under EU law, not just a new thing from GDPR. There's a case study from 2008 where a chief medical examiner refused to edit their findings in a HR file for an employee, and the employee won the right, the employee won the opportunity to have their medical records and their medical reports from their consultants appended into their HR record because it presented a different perspective on the medical condition that they had and their fitness for work. The chief medical officer had refused to change the record because it was their view, which is perfectly correct, but the organization then had to allow the additional information to be added to the HR system. And they weren't in a position to do that straight away. They had to get the HR system modified, as I understand, to enable that to happen. So under GDPR, it's the same sort of right exists, simply to add additional information. Like in my case, companies keep sending me correspondence to Miss Daragh O'Brien, because Daragh is one of those wonderful names that is both male and female. And occasionally I send a photograph of me to them and I ask them, I'm not female, I'm male, please correct your data. I have turned up in person to complain from time to time. Adding an additional piece of data to the record to say this name is actually a male name, and change the gender tag on the record, or putting a comment in to make sure that people don't correct the name or correct the gender associated with the name simply because they believe the name is female, which has happened on a few occasions.
I think that's a perfect segue into how Service Objects started. Our CEO, Jeff Groh, who spells his name Geoff, basically was sick of getting mail with his name spelled wrong in multiple ways, and that was the genesis of this whole company. Was we want to correct this data problem, and it's just funny that it sort of has come full circle to the GDPR.
Yeah, there are 13 different ways of spelling the name Daragh. It exists in 9 languages, and it's gender neutral in all of them. So by the time I got people to spell my first name right, I didn't care about the spelling of my second name. My Starbucks name is Dave.
I think we have time for one more. I'm just going to try and read this. What is your view on the right to be forgotten portion of the law, and how far does this deletion of the data go versus retaining it for your company, for our company?
Okay, the right to be forgotten is a misnomer. The right of erasure is the right in question. It's not a right to be completely forgotten, and it is not an absolute right. It's a case-by-case decision based on whether the organization has legitimate grounds for retaining the data. And also, it isn't necessarily a right to have all of the data deleted. If you're holding data that you no longer have a purpose for, well, yes, you need to get rid of that data anyway. So if someone asking you to delete it is simply reminding you of your obligations. But if you've got a very clear, compelling reason to retain the data, an overriding basis for doing so, you can retain the data. But the key element of this is it's a case-by-case judgment call, which is a decision that has to be documented, which means your governance structures need to be in place to support that. If you look at the Google Spain case, which is the current right to be forgotten as we understand it pre-GDPR, that is simply a right to be de-indexed from a search engine. It did not require the original newspaper to delete the website references or the original print copy relating to the individual in question's tax affairs. It just meant that Google needed to stop having it appear as result 1 for Mr. Gonzalez every time someone searched for his name, because the information was no longer relevant and there was no longer a purpose for Google to be presenting it that high in the search engine index. The current right to be the right of erasure, similarly, there are more points for potential rebuttal in the legislation than there are opportunities for an individual to avail of it, but it does require an appropriate governance to be put in place so that your decision making on that is transparent and robust. And there are very clear grounds in a lot of cases, very obvious examples. I can't ask the Irish Tax Authority to forget about me so I don't have to pay my taxes.
That's a good ending note.
Much and all as I would wish to.
Don't we all? Thank you, Daragh. Thank you, Tom. I really appreciate everyone's time here. A couple housekeeping notes. We'll definitely be sending out a link to the webinar, the recording of the webinar, and the slide deck. Give us maybe a day to get all that together for everybody, and anyone who's signed up will get a copy of that. I also want to thank, again, Tom and Daragh for joining us. Please check out their new books. Dara's is coming out in May. Good timing, by the way, Daragh, right before the GDPR goes into effect. And Tom's book on getting in front of data. We also have, Service Objects also has a white paper on the GDPR. We invite you to download it. It's on the website. You can click on the link in the presentation. And thank you very much. And look forward to seeing or talking to anyone soon.